This is the inner sphere. Thousands of planets colonized by humankind.
For every action, there is generally an equal but opposite reaction. The rise of the Draconis Combine, Free Worlds League, and Terran hegemony created a dangerous threat to smaller nations and organizations as colonialism was becoming ever more a way of life. Smaller entities would begin to scramble and merge for their own self-defense. So was the case with the independent nations of the Tamar Pact, Federation of Sky, and Protectorate of Donegal. In 2339, Kevin Tamar called a summit which included himself, Thomas McQuiston of the Federation, and Simon Masden of the Protectorate of Donegal. These governments had enjoyed a close mercantile alliance and all could see the hunger of the various growing houses. They would ultimately form the Lyran Commonwealth. At first, there was a disagreement on how the newly created empire would be ruled, but ultimately, it was agreed upon that the classical Greek city-state model would be used. There would be 9 archons over the realm, and the Greek lyre would be adopted as it was a neutral symbol that did not set one nation above the other. The next 25 years of the fledgling government's existence would not be kind. An ineffective governing body, economic downturn, and public discord plagued the population of the Commonwealth. Less than 3 decades had occurred, and already there were talks of succession and the Commonwealth creating even smaller successor states. That would be until Robert Marsden took control in August 2375. Marsden pushed for a populist uprising and declared himself Archon Basileus. He reformed the government, giving every member world one representative who then appointed him to power. This man of opportunity crafted a trade relationship with the Terran hegemony and enforced a nationwide currency. After only 15 years, he would pull the Commonwealth from the brink of destruction. All of the newfound wealth and prosperity would be poured into the military to ensure that the Lyrans could not be threatened by their neighbors. However, while the military would grow in scope and power, they wouldn't be putting much into their leadership. The Lyran military was not only inept, but stupid. Either that or they were corrupt to hell and back. Apparently, by Marsden simply stating that he would enjoy drinking wine from the planet named Promised Land, the Lyran military interpreted that as an order to attack, and so began a full-scale invasion of a Free World League member state. This was disastrous for the Lyrans as they would lose 10 LCAF regiments, which included 2 elite jump infantry and armored vehicle regiments. The military blamed this blunder on Robert, stating that he was the one that gave the order. Mysteriously, Robert Masden would be found dead from a heart attack a week later. Yeah. While fears of a military coup were rampant throughout the Commonwealth, they were seemingly abated when the military high command asked Marsden's brother, Alastair, to take control. The brother of the savior was at first reluctant, but ultimately did assume the throne. However, this peace and seeming prosperity wouldn't last that long. When the Age of War began, with the conflict between the Free Worlds League and Capellan Confederation, Archon Alastair ordered a build-up of military assets. The man poured huge sums of money and training into the defense of the Lyran Commonwealth for, well, nothing to happen. The Lyran worlds remained untouched, and as they remained untouched, the military began to degrade as other projects became more and more important. Eventually, even Alastair began to feel like it was unnecessary, not worrying about any possible future war, and opting even to marry Catherine Steiner in 2405. Unfortunately for the Commonwealth, Draconis Combine would take advantage and their forces staged an invasion. This major offensive, occurring on January 1st, 2407, was hugely successful. The Combine ripped through Lyran defense forces and a beeline was being made for the capital of Arcturus. Alastair, enraged by the impotence of his military, fired all of the high command and took direct control. The leaders of the Lyran military had been completely unable to stop the Draconis Combine. In fact, they were resorting to scorched earth policies and were raising their own facilities as well as civilian cities and towns just to try to stop the Combine from gaining more land. This practice was ineffective and the Lyrans were losing more and more. Alastair enacted war powers, giving him a near dictatorship, and moved the capital city from Arcturus to Tharkod. He rallied his troops and was able to blunt the Combine advance at Morningside, just one jump away from Arcturus. He even staged a raid on Combine facilities at Vega, which he had learned was being used as a staging area. The raid is considered the most successful military operation in Commonwealth history. Dropships, munition stores, and spaceports were all in flames after he was done. He would then move to Minkint to assist against a Combine raid. This is where he would be killed.
Archon Katrina Steiner was quick to rule out the deployment of additional troops to deal with the bandit threat. Sending additional Steiner forces to Karma 5.
There are points in time that change the history of an empire drastically. The first would probably be the murder of Robert. This unforeseen heart attack, which would install a puppet into the throne, installing his brother into the seat of power. The next would be Alistair's likely murder, in one way or another. The next would be the unfortunate death of Alistair that definitely wasn't a setup, and the rise of his widow who pressed her claim. One Catherine Marsden. She would find wide support from political allies and was confirmed by the Estates General in April 2408. She beat out 3 of her claimants and would renounce her original name, resuming her maiden name of Steiner. This would bring the Steiners into power over the Lyran Commonwealth. Catherine would quickly move to transform the Lyran Commonwealth into a Steiner Dynasty by creating the Commonwealth Council, the Scout Group, which was to explore space, enacting laws requiring German to be the official language, creating a noble class with Teutonic titles, encouraging the use of the kroner as the nation's currency, and replacing the lyre with Steiner's fist as the emblem. You know, just another day for someone who was living in this universe. She also was a signatory to the Ares Convention, creating rules and regulations for how war would be conducted in order to limit civilian casualties. Catherine instituted vast efforts to help planets recover from the war, as well as colonize every world within the borders of the nation, which, to be fair, did assist the Commonwealth in recovery, but also empowered the Steiner Dynasty. War would still occur though, as the Lyrans and the Free Worlds League slugged it out. The war would last until 2418 with an armistice, but it wouldn't last long as the Commonwealth attacked the League again in 2420. Ultimately, it all ended in the same year when the Lyrans routed the Free Worlds League. The war would go back and forth until Peter Merrick II rose to Captain General for the Free World, and the Lyrans, at this point now fighting a war against the Draconis Combine and the League, saw itself, well, get stopped, and would lose vast territories. In 2445, Catherine stepped down from the throne and her son, Alistair Steiner, would come into power. By this time, the Lyran military was in shambles, and the Lyrans were losing planets and territory from both the Draconis Combine and the Free Worlds League. Something had to be done in order to stop the bleeding. Alistair, in a moment of genius, ordered the Lyran military to still specifications for a new megaweapon, the battle mech. In 2455, the Lyran military conducted a command raid against the Terran hegemony on a planet the two governments had jointly shared. It would be successful, and battle mechs would begin to see use in 2459 by the Lyrans. Production facilities would be built on Alarion and Coventry. The Terrans were extremely upset when they realized that their technology had been stolen, but, well, money is always good for business, and so the hegemony would enact trade restrictions but refuse to go to actual war. The Commonwealth conducted what is known as the Long March, a 4-year offensive that would see the return of many planets to the Lyrans from the League. But, as is the life of a Lyran, the League would finally get battle mechs of their own and once again turn the tides. The inconsistent performance of the Lyran Commonwealth is best explained by the corruption and unstable state of its leadership. At one point, a Steiner, specifically Stephen Steiner, would take the throne and become the Archon. Unfortunately, his wife, Margaret Olsen, was the one to mainly lead the Lyran forces. She was a mystic that relied on omens and superstitions. The Archon's reign would become weaker and weaker, with the nobility beginning to take powers away that had once been delegated. When the Archon himself, again Stephen, died, many wanted Robert Steiner to take the throne, whereas Margaret Olsen insisted that she would rule the Commonwealth. Oh, Robert Steiner was a bastard child who had some Steiner in him, and another. We're dealing with battle tech here. It's really all confusing.
Roger, Command. We'll do our best. Who the hell are they?
Rifle fire and incoming hostile. Area. Back Palace personnel. Rally point echo immediately.
We've got these 4 lenses up the wall. 4 units. Looks mostly like LRM launches.
Sigma Lead, this is Sigma 2. Any idea what we're up against?
Well-equipped strike forces. Probably the 5th Donegal.
That's my old unit. Why would our own forces attack us?
Again, Margaret Olsen insisted that she should rule the Lyrans, and this of course meant that civil war would break out, with public support firmly leaning towards Robert himself. Several forces joined Steiner in his opposition of Margaret, and they would quickly stomp Olsen's forces. Every noble that had supported Olsen would be stripped of their holdings and titles, and loyal nobility that had been on the side of the Steiners were granted these privileges. Robert pushed for peace and dedicated the Lyran forces to a defensive footing and reactive actions. though some attacks would still occur, like that of Magray's being captured in 2508. Ultimately, Robert would abdicate his throne in lieu of Craig Steiner taking power. Craig pushed for the same policies as his father. He would even sign a treaty that allowed the Terran hegemony to garrison forces on worlds that were contested between the Commonwealth and the Free Worlds League. Craig enacted several economic policies which pulled the Lyrans from the brink and established the Commonwealth Supreme Court, a judicial body that he would share power with. In 2555, Craig dies and the Chief Justice of the Court is named his successor. I bet you can't guess her last name, which would be Tracial Steiner. Tracial would sign the Tharkin Accords, pledging the Lyran Empire to the Starleague. This was a very popular action, though that was likely due to Albert Merrick funding several pro-Starleague factions and bribing many advisors. The Lyran Commonwealth would ultimately join the Starleague when Viola Steiner Dynasty, Tracial's daughter and successor to the Archon Slot, signed the Starleague Accords. While this meant prosperity for many in the galaxy, the lower-income Lyrans would not be of that stripe. The Starleague enacted heavy taxes on the Lyran Commonwealth, which was spread evenly among the populace. This would be fine for richer planets, but the ones with economic hardship would be devastated. A revolt was bolstered on several Lyran worlds, and Viola would instead of curb stomping them, instead invited all of the aggrieved parties together and began to create reforms that would ensure all citizens were taken care of. This decision to use diplomacy instead of mechs endeared the citizenry to her. Thanks to the machinations of the Steiners, the culture of the Lyrans is dominated by its Germanic heritage. The history of the Commonwealth shows that it was historically more diverse, though, with populations from Northern Europe, Australia, Africa, East Asian, and even the Americas. Even with all of this diversity, though, prejudices based on racial preference appear to be a thing of the past. The focus is more on class warfare, and most citizens showing allegiance to their individual planet rather than the state itself. Lyrans were often the most well-educated, and the Commonwealth was considered the most stable during that of the Starleague. There is also, ironically, no official state religion, and a freedom to worship is guaranteed. It's strange to think that while there is a lot of corruption and malfeasance at the very top, the common Lyran citizen lives quite well. The Lyran military was generally one of the best equipped forces in the Inner Sphere. It was only held back by inept leadership due to a rank known as Social Generals. Social Generals were top officers that did well when it didn't come to battle, and thus were given this prestigious title. This meant that they would lead ground forces and ultimately get a lot of people killed. The military is broken up into the High Command, Regional Commands, and Military Departments, with it having a Battle Mech Corps, Armored Corps, Infantry, Artillery, Combat Engineer, Supply Services, Transportation Services, and Signal Corps. There are also several non-combatant commands under that. The Lyrans also have the Commonwealth Aerospace Forces as well as the Reserve Corps. Lyran combat doctrine was rather simple, which would show just how incompetent that they could be. Ultimately, the idea would be to attack and attempt to overpower an enemy rather than use any kind of tactical advantage. It was often thought that a lot of these losses were due to not having generals being chosen based on their lineage. As stated, if not for the economic might of the Lyran Commonwealth, it might not have been as powerful nor as effective as it ultimately was. The military was a direct reflection of the politics of the Commonwealth. The seat of power, originally on Arcturus and moved to Tharkad, as I've noted, would have the Archon, which is the head of state and commander-in-chief. This person ultimately had the authority in domestic and foreign policy. While it was never originally intended to be hereditary, it became so after the Steiner family came into power. The Estates General was the original representative body and had authority with 300 representatives across the Commonwealth. Its power, though, slowly was chipped away by the Archonship and other events. The Royal Court is where most events occur and is where 2 Griffin battle mechs are stationed to protect the Archon, which honestly, it's just very Lyran. The council was created and instituted by Catherine Steiner, as I've discussed, and allowed her to secure support for the Steiner Dynasty. The Commonwealth Council will have a varying amount of power depending on if a Steiner is truly in charge or not, but has been able to ensure peace and prosperity in a lot of ways. The Lyran Commonwealth is ultimately what happens when a bunch of merchants decide to get together and form a superpower, and then are taken over due to inept government officials and a power-hungry family that leads them back into prosperity. Somehow. It's capitalism, but with more steps, somehow succeeding. I guess we all should be ruled by merchants is what this is telling me.